Thank you, ladies, for joining us. This is a great way to close the day, talking about what works and what matters. This is another one of those conversations that truly intersects with all of it, and I think all the conversations we've had. So I wonder, before we jump in, I mean, here are two incredible Latina women who are leading in incredibly important organizations and have built successful and highly visible careers. And so I'd just love to take a moment, like we were joking earlier with Tiffany Ashley Bell and with Aaron Teague at YouTube, like the unicorns, and it's like, we're not unicorns, we exist, right? It's about visibility and access to platforms to be celebrated. But can you just both each take a moment and share, and maybe we'll start with you, Karla, and then come to you, Viv, a little bit about your own story.
Yeah. So I grew up in a low-income community in Southern California. My mom is from Mexico, my dad is from Guatemala. They met in Southern California. My mom was undocumented for a part of my childhood. I remember realizing how poor we were at the point at which I filled out the FAFSA, and like having a moment of like, oh, the net worth of this household, like what my parents make a year is $23,000, right? And realizing that my parents like had both bought a home and put two kids into school on that money, and it like had made a commitment to myself at that point in time that I was not going to be an economic burden to my family from that moment on. So first to go to college, first my family to have a career, definitely the first CEO of my family. That was like, yeah.
Say that one more time. First CEO of my family.
First CEO in the family. That was a lot of tears for my mom. I don't think it's funny because we were talking about the transition and so much of it was like what needs to happen for the organization. It wasn't until I talked to my mama and my brother that I was like, oh, right, I'm the first CEO in the family. My brother, I remember saying, he's like, yeah, my daughter will always grow up with a tia that's a CEO now, which was like pretty awesome. I spent all my life in the social sector and the nonprofit sector. I've done after-school programming. I've helped scale 3 organizations from small to large, like a volunteer program from 300 to 3,000 people, a staff team at the intersection of health and poverty from 15 people to 85 people. And I stepped into Code 2040 at the point that we were 6 employees, and now we're 35 people serving 4,000 person community.
That's amazing.
Yeah. And at Code 2040, we exclusively focus on the Black and Latinx community and all of its wonderful nuances, and the goal there is to create an equitable tech future. Like, we believe that the future of the country is really getting determined in technology, and if the architects do not look like us, then we will have the same problems that we had in the first round of the country. And so both creating access for our community and holding accountability for the companies that we work with, and bringing our community along so that they can be change makers within the industry.
Incredible. It's just so inspiring to hear your story and just the many worlds you've lived in and what you bring with you from all of those experiences. Both my parents are first-generation college students, and so that deeply resonates with me, just thinking about their journey and everything they've done to provide. It's just a very different life for me and for my siblings. We owe a debt. So Viv is just one of my favorite humans on earth. She's an incredible woman. And so Viv, I know a little bit about your story, but they don't.
So thank you, Kat. You're one of my favorite people too. And I'm so happy to be here. And it's amazing to be here 3 years later. And we'll get into that.
Yeah.
Because so much in the world has changed
so
since.
Much.
So my father is Colombian, my mother is Puerto Rican and Cuban, and on that note of owing a debt, that is sort of what I feel, that is how I attempt to live my life every day, right? I actually grew up with the recognition that I had an incredible amount of privilege. Yeah. My parents did not, and then they did, right? They did not, and then the tides changed. And as a result, my brothers and I grew up living incredibly different lives than my parents lived. And there's something in seeing that transition and in hearing the stories of your parents' lives and their experiences that teaches you a few things. One is that they didn't do it on their own, that there was this community around them. They can point to certain people who made very key decisions that had these outsized impacts in their life. And so there's that lesson of like nobody actually goes at it alone. And then there's a second lesson, which is that there's actually no better way to live your life than repaying that debt, right? Paying it forward to other people. And so I have also spent all of my career in public service. And well, both of us, I think, many of us, and the lens through which I've approached my work is from a position of privilege, really from a position of privilege, because the White House is a position of privilege. The foundation that I work for now is a position of privilege. How can you create the most positive change for the communities that need it most in the world? And that's sort of been the driving question, because as I think through, my own experience and that of my family members, and the family members that are still living in Latin America, you sort of ask yourself, well, if not you, then who is creating those opportunities for them? And when you frame it that way, it actually makes it very easy to get up and do that work, because if no one were there to create it for your family, right, we wouldn't have the life that we have today. And so it's how I tend to orient myself in the work that I do.
I love that. It's two incredible, inspiring leaders up here. I would love for you guys to define equity and social impact, and what that means to you, what that means for your organizations, and maybe take us a little bit deeper into the work you're driving.
Social impact? Okay. So quite literally, I define social impact as the effect that an organization is having on, specifically in my mind, its own community, right? We're sort of all responsible for our communities. And if we all did that, the world would be a much better place. And then within that, it's the positive impact that it's having on the community, and how an organization thinks about its own work with respect to the people who are being impacted by the decisions that they're making. And sometimes the positive social impact is reflected directly in the work that they do, and sometimes it's indirect. And so Habitat for Humanity is a great example of direct. And then, I heard today, and I don't know if this is happening, but I'm just going to start saying it in the hopes that it will become true, that there's hopefully we'll move to a place where Amazon starts accepting EBT and also foster care certificates, so that the families can actually go on Amazon and purchase the supplies and the clothing for their children, for their foster children.
It's such a good point, because they're disrupting the retail experience. Malls are closing. There's less and less physical footprint for people to get to, and they get left in the gap.
Well, let me give you an example. There's only one Kmart in the state of Rhode Island that accepted the foster care vouchers, and that's the Kmart that all the families in Rhode Island would go to purchase clothing and school supplies for their kids. And then that Kmart shut down. And what happens is that literally in the state of Rhode Island, foster parents don't have a single place to go to redeem those vouchers. And so when you think of an organization that could create that social impact at a huge scale, and it would actually probably not cost them very much, and indirect to what their core work is, Amazon's a great example of that. It's how I tend to define it.
That's a powerful example. Thank you for that.
I think that I'm really glad there are as many engineers in the room as there are today. Often when we all get together for this that is not the case. But I think what I would love for you to know is that we are in the middle of a conversation about power, right? And who holds power, how money and social capital is distributed among communities. And tech is a architect of what that future is going to look like, right? The way, like in the first two products of an economy that are like tech's impact on the world is the shock economy, right? Which is like the ad revenue based economy, and the gig economy. And those are the first two. It is not the last of the reshaping of our economic structures, but it is definitely the first two, right? And if you look at the impact that those two parts of the economy have disproportionately on marginalized people, you start to understand how, in the absence of having people at the table that come from communities all over the spectrum of the country, of the world, how the decisions could get made that disadvantage people disproportionately very quickly. We are an accelerator of inequality when we do not think of things in that way, right? And so at Code 2040, I think that belief of how tech is doing that to the economy and to the social contract drives a belief that the architects at the table have to much more represent our communities. We serve exclusively Black and Latinx people, and we provide access points for folks in that, into tech companies, but also, like, how are we having the conversations, the hard conversations with companies that not everyone is having, right? And I think when I think of like social impact and programs, like I've seen the difference. Like I'm the board chair for an organization called 1 Degree at 1DEG, if you're curious. And they do Yelp for nonprofit and social services. So if a mom is hungry today, she can go on 1 Degree and say, hey, like, where can I find food for my kids? And all of the places are there, and the mom can also rate and review the nonprofit or social service that she got, right? And I saw in the very beginning, so the board for our organization is all people of color representing Latinx, Black, and API communities. And in the beginning, funders made a real big push that families are not going to go to some place to find resources on their own. And because the founder was from an API community, had lived undocumented for most of his life, the decision he made was to say, no, I don't believe you, right? And now 1 Degree serves 250,000 people in the Bay Area every single year, connecting them to the resources and the social safety net that they're due, right? And so those decisions look different when you are not from and know the community that you are impacting.
Powerful. One thing, Karla, I want to dig into a little bit is, one of the discussions was the recent grads and sharing their stories of, how early does the pipeline leak? And for me, I met Billy, who was on the panel, who founded WeCode at Harvard, when I spoke there, and I was heartbroken because you're talking to women engineers across the country, across the spectrum of educational programs, and continually it was the story of, professors and fellow students dismissing the contributions of women. And I know one of the things that Code 2040 does, and so how that carries through is like it starts there, it probably starts way sooner, but it just keeps getting amplified as you enter the workplace and listening to these young women bravely share, the challenges they've already seen 1 to 2 years in at their career. And so when you think about, like, one of the things I love that Code 2040 does, I thought maybe you could speak to, is how you're coaching the tech organizations around how to create more those hard conversations. Yeah. What are some of the things you're saying?
Yeah. So some of it is about data, right? So previous to having our student group or our company, our organization, they have had very little exposure to a larger group of Black and Latinx people, right? So if I'm coming in with 50 Black and Latinx students, and everyone looks at those students like they're zoo animals, then those students give us feedback and we give that feedback back to the company, right? And so something that is like as simple as like a spring break trip where everyone's coming to get to know tech companies, which happens all the time. Every company that we work with gets a data pack at the end and is like, hey, 75% of these students were willing to work with and for you beforehand, or were interested in employment there, and only 20% of them are excited about working for you now. Let's talk about the qualitative data that we collected that tells us that you're around the barometer of your inclusion, right? I would say for the first, Code 2040 is 6 years old. For the first 4 years, we did not run a program. So maybe year one we didn't, it was fine, but after that, like, we did not run a program where we did not have an incident where a young woman was sexually harassed. where we had to hold accountability for an executive team for the situations that they had put people to, and folks have lost jobs, and I've had CEOs cry on the phone about like, how did this happen in my company? And that really taught us a lot about how we prepare our young women for going in, and to understand like, how do they make the boundary lines around what is okay and not okay with them, so that they never have to sit in a room and be like, was this me?
Yeah.
Right? And that identity work is like really core to how we operate with our student group. And then the feedback loop and holding companies accountable is important on the other end with the company. And I would say that because we are an external actor giving that feedback, we hold more power than an individual in a company often, because if you are like depending on this place for your salary and no one's listening to you, it's really dangerous for you to speak up, right? And we don't have the same compulsions, right?
That is a heartbreaking and a critical piece of information you shared too, that just further illustrates the systemic nature of also individual actions, right? Viv, I would love to shift gears a little bit and have you talk to some examples of people's and programs making impact. I mean, your point about Amazon and sort of this opportunity, right, and what's happening in Rhode Island, I think is just a glaring example of like opportunity for impact. What are some things you're seeing where people are, things that excite you that you're seeing that you're like, wow, these are things that you would point to say, people can do this. This is not, it's not rocket science.
Yeah. So where my heart and brain tend to go is less toward like space exploration and more toward the very basic but very difficult problems to solve here on Earth.
Yeah.
So food assistance, child welfare, immigration, policing, those are the big ones. And so where I get most excited, it's just, and I have a technical background, but where I get most excited is just in the application of technology for very human problems, with the caveat that has to be built with the community and with the users at the very center of that problem solving. So a few things that excite me, and this is so procurement and government procurement is very wonky, and I won't say that excites me. It definitely excites me. But there was a New York Times article the other day about a company called Propel, and if you're not familiar with them, you should definitely look into them. But they are now going up against one of the biggest government contractors that owns 80% of EBT data. And what they had built was this easy-to-use third-party app that lets someone know what their EBT, what their food stamp balance was. But because they actually have people on their teams who were food stamp recipients or who grew up in households that were dependent on EBT, they went beyond the just check your balance, and they moved into the space of couponing. What stores near you are having sales this week? How can you create low cost but nutritious meals for your families? And parents, here are some ways to work meditation and exercise into your daily routine for 5 to 10 minutes, because we know that these are families that are experiencing significant stress. And so there's something about going beyond the surface level, because you've had that experience, that makes a product so much better than what someone who has not experienced that would say, give them the balance. That's what they need to know. They need to know more. They need to know how they can use that balance to make their lives and the lives of their families significantly better and get through the obstacles that they're currently facing. So Propel is a really great example. M-Relief is working in California. They have built an end-to-end food stamp application, third-party app for CalFresh, and they're now in 48 states and have served over 250,000 families. Propel serves over 1 million families every single month. Just to speak selfishly about some of the work that our team at New America is doing, Raf Majma, who's also an alum of the U.S. Digital Service, he's an incredible person. He led the U.S. government in redesigning the refugee admissions process so that we could cut down the time, along with Sabrina, who's also in the audience. There. Thank you, Raquel. Thank you. redesigning the refugee admissions process. And what's amazing is that there's something about, especially for non-technical audiences, technology like gets you to the table. I can't tell you how many nonprofit leaders keep on asking me if they need the blockchain, and I'm like, no, what are you doing? But while I have you on the phone, can we talk about how you're using Excel, right? Like, it's so bizarre because it's this thing, you know, they're so drawn to like the new sexy thing, and that's great. Like, I'll take it. And then I will have a very long conversation with you about your paper-heavy process.
Talk about the impact of that, because that was what led to...
And now I feel like we should bring Sabrina on stage. There were some significant policy changes, right? There was this question about whether we would be able to get, it went up to 100,000, from 80,000 to 100,000 refugees over one calendar year. Is that right? Yes, Sabrina? 85, okay. And we didn't think that we would meet those numbers because we were having a hard time meeting the previous number, and nothing was changing. They were getting no extra money and no extra staff, but a significant increase in how many refugees we were going to try and process and get into the United States safely before the end of the fiscal year, which is in September. And so Raf and Sabrina and this team, it's really this end-to-end like process re-engineering where you're meeting with all of the stakeholders and the constituents, and you're learning about how they do their work. And pretty soon what you realize is that it's not actually about the technology, it's about the very dumb, heavy-handed policy that we've created. That means that the example that I heard that was just my favorite was that there are like 10 security background checks that refugees go through across 4 different agencies, and they all have to say yes at the same exact time, but they all have different expiration dates, and none of them are run at the same exact time. So a family would finally get a green check on this, and then they would get it on the second one, and then the first one would expire, and then they'd get the third one, and the second one would expire. And so it was taking, we thought 18 months to get one refugee family through the entire process. It was actually taking upward of 2 to 3 years. This like incredibly long time for the most vetted population on Earth, despite what certain people would say. And the changes that this technical team brought to the US government actually had very little to do with technology and a lot to do with process and policy that has changed so many lives. And so Raf, now that I went on a tangent, is now doing very similar work with immigration coalitions that today are facing the very real problem of having to figure out how to rapidly reprocess people. So what that means is, as certain immigration classes are increasingly under attack, how can we rapidly reprocess you and see if you classify, if you can be approved for a different category. And that's a very, very paper-heavy process, and it takes a lot of time and a lot of lawyers in a space where we are not getting more lawyers, and we're definitely not getting more time. And so there's a lot of work that he's doing around process re-engineering there that I think, knock on wood, is going to end up having a significant impact on people who are just waiting to hear back about their immigration benefits. And we're doing that from outside government since we're no longer in it.
Yeah. Powerful stuff. It's my honor to work with all these brilliant folks. I do want to shout out Sabrina. Sabrina, if you can just stand so we can say hi.
Now we're going to make you stand.
So what you should know about Sabrina is she has a double major in both philosophy and computer science from Stanford. She was HP, then Google engineer, and then she came to the United States Digital Service. When she left, she was the acting engineering director for our entire engineering team. And now she's at Dignity Health. So she's just another one of those unicorns that are not unicorns, that are real human beings. So I want to, quick question. I think we've got actually more time than we think. So we're ending at 5, so ignore the clock. I want to switch to you, Karla, and talk a little bit about, from your perspective, what are the impacts of when we solve equity? What are some of the examples you're seeing? What's getting you excited about what's possible?
I mean, I think I spoke about one, right? Like 1 Degree and the work that is happening there. I think there's a woman by the name of Kristen Sonde who was one of our entrepreneurs in residence. She runs a tech company called Paladin, and Paladin does work with law firms to organize their pro bono work because they had no kind of system for that and no kind of billing for it. And now the pro bono functions both of like big corporations and their general counsels, because there's a certain amount of pro bono that a lot of lawyers have to give if they're barred in particular states, is now being much more systemically delivered to people who are greatly in need, right? I think I've watched, I think another example of this is, one of our community members was one of the original engineers at Yammer. And when Yammer had an exit, he was able to accrue equity. So he had the exit. That gave him and his wife enough money to buy a house in San Francisco, impossibility of all impossibilities. And then, so now you have a Black family moving into the Bayview, right? And then she was able to be one of our entrepreneurs in residence and start her company, Ania Rogers start her company, Tinsel, right? And so you start to see the impacts of having access to the wealth and networks, right? And because the VC, that's a whole other can of worms world is what it is. I think she stepped back and was like, you know what, how do I help a bunch of Black and brown founders get their company started without having to access capital? And she started the Black and Brown Founders Project, right? And I just think that it's like small things that happen. Getting one person pulls you into a company, that company has an exit. You are able to deploy that exit in a particular way for your community, and you start to see the growth of wealth and resources within a community, right? I do not believe that we can code our way to equity. I just don't. There are big, big problems to solve there. However, I do think we can open up exponential opportunities for our people to be in positions of power that are decision-making positions that can eventually bridge us into equity. And I cannot emphasize enough how important it is for us not to be satisfied with what our companies are doing right now and how they are operating, right? I know that it feels lonely, and I just really want to acknowledge that. I know that many of you work at companies where you are trying to knock on the door all the time and getting them to change, and I get that is hard work. It is emotional labor, and do not be silent, because the fruit of that work, the fruit of it, and it may be fruit that you never see, is other people getting access to that and us having a chance to change the rules of power in our country.
So we could keep going, but I want to turn over for questions. So please raise your hand if you have questions. Is Molly by chance? Molly, can we give Molly a hand? She is actually our web developer for the Team Tech Superwomen, and she is double duty right now in running mics. We really appreciate you, Molly. If you have questions, please raise your hand. Anyone have questions? Oh, perfect. We've got 2 questions.
Hi, I'm Bridget. Earlier, McKinday was talking about how he can be an ally and how he's kind of been an ally to women in the office. And I'm a white, straight woman. I want to know how I can better be an ally to the women of color and the LGBT people in my office, and if there are anything you've seen or any strategies you've seen that have really been effective to helping the women and the POCs in your office really be encouraged to speak up, because it's important.
Talk to other white, straight women. I cannot tell you how many times I have seen someone speak up and for there to be resentment about that person speaking up, for them not to have an army behind them defending them or believing them. And in the absence of you being white will open doors for you for conversation that people of color will not have. And the work, I think there is, how do you do sponsorship where you are in a room and you point out the good work of a person of color, a woman of color, a man of color, a woman of color. This is a small one also, but when people say women and people of color, correct them. It is people of color and white women, right? It immediately erases women of color when we do that. And I think that's a really small language change that can remind people that when we say, oh, we're going to choose to work on women for diversity, that what they're talking about is exclusively white women. And like things like that, the sponsorship, the internal advocacy, changing parts of your language and making sure that you are talking to other white women about being advocates for people of color make a big difference.
I like that answer because I think any inside-outside group, right? For me, being a straight woman, like how can I be a better ally to the LGBTQ community? I feel like I still have so much to learn, on that journey. And so thinking about, how can those of us on any in-group hold each other accountable relieves the burden of the target group, which is good ally language.
One of my favorite humans and white lady allies is Erie Meyer, who is now at Code for America and was previously at USCS. And the allyship, I feel like, and this is in no way it's not an attempt to dumb it down, but I feel like we have to be very concrete in what you're asking people to do. Because when you ask people to just be better, it's like, well, if people could just be better or different, then like we wouldn't be having this conversation anyway. And so Erie had a very specific asks that she would make of people. So for example, there was a doorbell in our office at Jackson Place at the White House, which some people have worked there or had been to. And every time that the doorbell rang, it was always a woman who got up to open it. Like we were the office receptionist. And so she made a rule. She spoke quietly. She did not shame people. She did not have a tantrum over it. She very quietly approached 4 different guys and said, will you take on the responsibility of opening the door every time the doorbell rings? And it's like a very small thing, but then they carried it with them, like this act of I am going to put down my work because my work is just as important as that of my female colleagues, and I'm going to get up and I am going to go open the door. And then and then another thing that she did, and I saw her do quite a bit, is that when somebody was being ignored, she asserted herself as but can you go back and did you hear what Vivian said, right? Like she said that first, right? Or they said this thing first. And so she was constantly calling people out. I think that very small things, if you are in that position and you can be the one that says by the way, that was Kat's idea, that was Vivian's idea, that was Karla's idea, it takes the burden off of the person who's sitting there being that was my idea, and I'm gonna go home and figure out how I get through this moment because it keeps on happening. The other thing, I'll stop there. Very concrete things are what can make someone's day much easier.
This is such a good question. I think we have time for one more if we make it quick. Is there one more question that anyone has? Yes, ma'am, up here. Can we come up to the...
Aren't there 2? Same.
Oh, we have so many. Okay. Why don't we take all 3 and then we'll answer them. So just ask your questions and they'll try and answer all 3 in one fell swoop.
Hi, I just had a question about someone that's interested in tech but more on the creative side and what's happening in that area. Are there opportunities and what are they and how do I find out more about them?
That's a great question. Thank you. I think we have a question up front, but is there one more? Okay, perfect.
Hi, my name is Nina. I'm from Brazil, and I'm a woman in tech. I'm a black woman in tech. And I wanted to ask for you about how to change the mentality, the mindset of the community about the social impact, because in Brazil, we are more connected with government responsibility. People never see that we have responsibility inside the other institutions. Mm-hmm. I have an institution, the name is Black Money Movement, and people never see this like a good thing because it's about capital, it's about money. And people think that, oh my God, it's social impact. It's not about money, it's about NGO, and it's not that. Yeah. And for this reason, I wanted to ask you about how to improve and how to develop the mindset for the social impact inside the private institutions.
Thank you. And was there one more question? Did you have a question in the hat? Yeah.
No?
Oh, perfect. Okay.
Okay.
Awesome. So who wants to take the creative question first, and then we'll get into, expanding how do you help new organizations and countries really rethink the social contract in terms of our obligation.
On the creative question, my hair covers the thing. On the creativity question, did you mean along the lines of design or art or music? Was there a specific, all of them? I have less of an answer here, although actually I've had a lot of people reaching out to me recently talking about the role of creativity in education, especially for young children and for young girls. So I remember Mike Strautmanis, he went to be a VP, he was at the White House, he went to be a VP at Disney. And one of the first emails that I got from him was, Disney is suddenly really worried about the fact that by the time that a girl turns 12, all of the creativity is sucked out of her, right? Like that same child who was like spunky and carefree and could take on the world is suddenly like so burdened by what society is telling her that she should be or she should look like, and we go into this shell and we lose all of our creative senses. And so I am beginning to see more companies, especially large companies like Disney and in media and production, and I live in LA now, and maybe that's why I'm seeing some more of it, who are really interested in how technology can be a vehicle for teaching, reteaching, reinstilling principles of creativity that allow people to sort of move freely throughout the world and the spaces that they occupy, especially when that's a really difficult thing to do.
So I'm going to answer the creative question real quick and then have you tackle the structural. I would just say, as someone who's a creative and a tech, like my major was in history, I minored in film rhetoric. I was a product manager out of school. So like I came into tech with a very different background, and still carry that creativity through and with me. So like, A, you're welcome in tech, even if you're not coding. I think that's a really important message we need to send out. B, you're needed. Like, the problem is, anytime you get people thinking of one way to solve a problem, we have a problem, right? The point is to bring different perspectives, and the creative method and what it takes to be creative can solve a lot of these problems. And I think part of what Viv and Karla have also signaled, that these often aren't technology problems. These are process problems. These are culture problems. These are how do we communicate challenges. And the arts are one of the most powerful ways to transmit ideas and to shift culture. So when you're thinking about what we're trying to drive and the culture change that needs to happen for women and in particular women of color and people of color as well to thrive, it's going to happen through culture. And so the creatives help define and create culture and voices. So you play a very important and powerful role.
So one other thing I'll add to that is, I think networking is how you get into this place. Like, it's just the way it is, right? And so I think we are taught in a lot of our communities, like, work really hard and you'll get the cookie, right? And that is not the way that the work world works. It's like networking. So I would say going online and looking up like design and tech, creativity in tech, and what are the happy hours and the things that are, so that you can start to get to know people. My favorite designer on the Twitters is Christy Tillman. She has designed at Slack. She is always giving out really good advice on her Twitter feed, and every once in a while opens up office hours. So I would take a look at that. And then I would say, like, start having conversations with companies that are interested in you, being like, hey, I know you're doing this work. I'm trying to figure out how you break into the industry, and I would love to hear more about your job. It's very interesting to me. And 90% of the people are not going to respond back. For that 10% that does, is going to be helpful, right? They're going to give you something, right? Do not be afraid to ask them to show up for you. And in particular, when you see that it is a Black or Latinx woman on the other end of that LinkedIn profile, because we get how hard it is to get in here.
Will you be here tomorrow? Yeah, so I don't know what's happening. She's speaking tomorrow, I think. The person who I think you should definitely talk to is Megan Smith. She's everything. She embodies creativity and tech in all forms. And so, if you'll be here tomorrow, you'll see her speak. That's an opportunity to ask a question. But if you want, I will also connect with you after this, and I will make sure that you two find like 5 minutes to chat tomorrow.
So I want to real quickly answer this because we are way over, but you can answer.
Yeah, so a couple things. So one, I would say the first task is to find your people, right? Because you can spend a lot of time banging on doors that are not going to open. But if you like go out and you find all the people that believe like you believe, which is not always obvious, right? Then a coalition of people can do more than one individual. And then it's not just you, right? And as that coalition of people, you decide on the language that you want to use and the way that you're going to influence. And I think that just, it lifts the burden of it. My uncle in Guatemala said to me that, like, mija, when you share the burdens, they're a little bit lighter, and that means that the celebrations are a lot bigger. And so, like, that is my first thought on that, is like, find your people. The second piece is, I think tying the economic impact to the social impact is always really important, because you're right, people care about money and dollars, right? We do not benefit as a society from having a group of poor people who can afford nothing and a group of rich people who can afford everything. Because let me tell you, rich folks are only going to buy 1 or 2 pillows, right? Like, they're never going to need as many pillows as the rest of the poor folks are going to need, right? And so how you create a society that is much more bridged together, right, is going to produce a much bigger economic impact. And right now, we're in an incredible demographic shift in this country, but in the world, full stop, right? And I know that when I talk to the big consulting firms, like the PwCs of the world and the Deloittes of the world, they're actually doing the people planning for this now, because they get, by the way Code 2040 gets its name, it's that by 2040, there will be more Black and Latinx people in the country than anything else by that decade. And it is not okay for that group of people to not be able to access high-skilled labor, right? It is not okay. And it will be catastrophic for the country if we transition to a high-skilled labor workforce and only certain people can be a part of it, and the low-skilled workforce, the majority of the country, cannot have jobs, right? There's just some stuff in that, right? And I know in Brazil there is a similar situation, right, where you've got a lot of folks that are people of color at the end of the economic spectrum. It is not good for rich people for that to be the case, right? They may not get it, but ultimately it is not good. That causes catastrophes down the line. And so part of how you evolve your language is to get their selfish interests at the table.
I'm just going to say one thing really quickly. We were talking about this earlier. There's a lot of shame surrounding money, and I wish that there weren't. Because you know who doesn't feel shame around money? Rich people. Only everyone else feels it, apparently. Only women and women of color and communities of color are told that money is a bad thing, that we should do things for other reasons, and we have to stop that immediately. We have to be shameless in our pursuit of money, because we are going to pay it back in our communities. But the best way to show that, I think, if you can think about, as when you said something that really resonated, which is this idea that the government is responsible. And this happens a lot in South America. I mean, it's my experience with Latinoamerica, is this idea that the government is responsible and then it fails and there's nothing that any of us have control over. And so I was thinking about examples in Colombia where the response seems to be those spaces where the government definitely is not reaching. And so if you start with thinking about those problems where the government is they're not even visible, right? Then nobody else can say that's the responsibility of the government, because they're not even there yet, right? They're not paying attention to those places. And so I wonder if in your own community you can think of examples where the government definitely is not, and then try and show some small visible successes for what the community can do to solve those problems, as a way of instilling that idea of culture change, right? That the notion that we are going to fix this together and our government is not coming for us anytime soon.
And I would say that's a model for how you can work within your tech companies as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
Can we give both of these ladies a hand?